Powerful, awe-inspiring, majestic and breathtaking. Moving water has fascinated and sustained humankind since the dawn of time. The irresistible force of gravity acting on water moves us, draws us near. For as long as we have built cities, we have built them on the banks of rivers. We use them for recreation, for transportation. They are linked to our cultures, our spirituality. They provide for our most basic of needs. But the reward of living in such close proximity to rivers comes with a degree of risk. Those who live along waterways know all too well the dangers, yet we continue to be drawn to their banks. Flooding is a natural part of river ecosystems. It serves to cleanse, to redistribute nutrients, and bring balance to a watershed. Although essential and beneficial, the notion of flooding brings a sense of fear and anxiety to human inhabitants living in the floodplain. It means a disruption of lifestyle, a risk to property and infrastructure, and in the worst cases, human casualties. The Elk River Alliance and the University of Lethbridge have been working together to assess these risks and develop plans to mitigate them. The ERA's Flood Solutions Strategy, due to be released in spring 2016, is a multi-level community program designed to educate area stakeholders about the causes, effects, and impacts of flooding in the Elk River. By learning as much as possible about how the watershed functions, perhaps those living in the floodplain can better coexist within it. Leanne Walker, Executive Director with the Elk River Alliance, explains why research in the Elk River watershed is so important.
We came up with the idea of the Elk River Flood Solution Strategy after the 2013 flood. In July of 2013, the mayor of Fernie, Mary Giuliano, called a meeting of municipal officials, elected officials, key industries, the mining industry, the forest industry, and community to sort of look at this particular event and try to figure out a way forward. What we needed was a collaborative, holistic, watershed-wide strategy. It's not effective to work on flooding in our little silos of our municipal boundaries, because what Elkford does affects what happens in the regional district. We all live downstream. We inherit, the cumulative effect of poor decisions. We need some way that we can all work together and pass on, the benefit of good decisions to our neighbors.
The Elk River watershed encompasses an area of more than 4,400 square kilometers. It lies along the British Columbia side of the Continental Divide with Alberta. The Elk River originates in the Elk Lakes Provincial Park north of Elkford, BC. Along its 220-kilometer journey to Lake Koocanusa, the Elk River is joined by more than 100 streams and tributaries. Typical discharges from BC Hydro's Elko Dam are in the order of 60 cubic meters per second. During the Elk River flood of 1995, the Water Survey of Canada estimated more than 800 cubic meters per second were flowing through. That's like having an Olympic-sized swimming pool passing through the floodgates every 3 seconds. The Elk River was first mapped in 1811 by explorer and fur trader David Thompson. Thompson initially called it the Stag River, but the name changed to Elk River after John Palliser published his map of the area in 1857. The Elk River Basin was first populated in the mid-1800s as resource development took hold in the mining and forestry sectors. These industries are still alive and well in the Elk River Basin, providing employment for a good percentage of area residents. Today, more than 14,000 people live in the watershed, concentrated in the communities of Elko, Elkford, Sparwood, Hosmer, and Fernie. The region is famous for its recreational opportunities, which in recent years have made up a good portion of the area's GDP. Skiing, hiking, camping, snowmobiling, and fishing are just a few of the activities enjoyed by area residents and tourists alike. With the diversity of land uses and a growing population, it is clear to see why watershed management is an important topic. Under the supervision of University Professor Dr. Jim Byrne, a small group of graduate students has been tasked with finding out what factors contribute to flooding in the Elk River watershed. For example, heavy snowpack in the mountains coupled with a warm, wet spring can create conditions for seasonal flooding. Industrial and commercial activities can also modify landscapes and their capacity to absorb moisture from rain and snow. In addition to local, regional, and seasonal factors, global processes are beginning to increase flood risks in watersheds around the world. Part of the work Byrne students are doing looks at how climate change is impacting the risk of flooding. As the planet warms, it increases the amount of moisture and energy that is absorbed by the atmosphere. This increased energy and moisture potential translates into greater potential for drought and rainfall. It also increases the frequency and intensity of weather events.
Elk River has a very significant problem with flooding. And so we're trying to determine, just how much of that flooding historically is probably going to remain with them, and how much of that flooding might be enhanced or really become worse because of climate change, because of land use change, all of which are certainly affecting the Elk River watershed to some degree. So what we want to do is determine, for Elk River, what's their future, what's the best projection in terms of what will they face for floods under changing land use and under scenarios of climate change. And we know that the climate is changing and it's going to affect Elk River substantially. Floods are very natural, and they happen all the time, and in fact they're a dynamic part of the ecosystem. They flush the system out, they deliver new nutrients from the uplands. But really what's happening is they're changing the landscape, they're taking away a lot of forest, they're going to take away a lot more forest with plans by some companies to take out huge acreages of forest in the Elk River watershed. That changes the way the whole watershed behaves. It tends to enhance flooding. Vegetation is like a sponge. Vegetation and soils are like sponges. They absorb water and hold it back. When you take away that vegetation, you remove a large part of the sponge, and so you start to get flashier floods, quicker floods, and the floods become more extreme. Add climate change to that, and you've now got more intense rainfalls, longer, harder rainfall, rain on snow events. Together, it's conspiring to maybe create a very challenging flood situation for the Elk River. 6 students working on the project, I think, on different components, looking at soil systems, looking at vegetation systems, looking at surface, looking a little bit at groundwater. Where we're trying to converge is in looking at how climate change, land use change will affect those big flood peaks. How do those big floods translate into water levels? Because that's really what people care about the most. They want to know, can you tell me if the water's going to make it to my house? Because if it is, I have a big problem.
There are several areas Byrne students are investigating in the Elk River drainage basin. The hope is to better understand how this natural system responds to change. PhD student Celeste Barnes is working closely with Cranbrook hydrologist Ryan McDonald to create hydraulic models of the area. These models will help communities better understand flood risk and how to prepare for those eventualities.
So what we're doing is we're taking data from the past and trying to use that data to predict future vulnerabilities for flooding in this case. There are a number of different things when you start looking at rivers and the amount of water that's flowing in a river. So for example, with climate change, you end up changing the amount of rain or snow and temperatures, and because those things are changing into the future, it's going to affect the amount of water that's actually in the rivers. We are actually trying to identify the potential for future flood events in the watershed. and we want to try and identify who might be at risk of flooding and what infrastructure might be at risk. So for example, if there's a bridge and the water levels get too high in the river, will the bridge be washed out? If there's homes, businesses, are they in danger of having water coming into them? And one of the things that we have to do to find out if there's, you know, risks of future flooding is we actually have to scientifically measure the amount of water that's in the river. And so what we do is we create these mathematical models so that we can try and predict where the water is going to flood and what physical infrastructure might be at risk.
For the Elk River flood strategy, we're looking at what are the main factors causing flooding in the valley. And in our area, kind of this part of the world, floods are really driven by rain on snow events. So that's one of the things we're trying to convey to people. It's like the June floods are pretty important. We're also trying to understand how land use and climate affect flood potential, so how those kind of things interact with the watershed and drive flooding. So typically a hydrology model or a watershed model is simulating the landscape and how water interacts with the landscape and how that then translates to stream flows. So a hydrology model really takes rain and snow, filters it through the land, with the trees, that type of thing, and you know, the resultant is stream flow or lake levels or whatever you're looking at. A hydrology model would give you a flow value. In one instance, you might have a flow value of 1,000 cubic meters per second. So it's a volume of water moving through a certain system. Whereas a hydraulic model would tell you how high that water is in that system. Essentially, volume over time, and the other one would be, you could think of it as depth. Land use is one of the first or second order drivers of hydrology. As you can imagine, water comes down from the sky, it has to interact with the land, and then it results in kind of going to groundwater, soil water, and into rivers. Our land use activities ultimately affect how water interacts with the land. Things like timber harvest, urban development, those types of things change the characteristics of the landscape in such a way that water travels differently across that landscape. And there's always going to be benefits and costs to resource development. Benefits being, you know, jobs and the economy and that type of thing. Costs being environmental degradation, loss of habitat for different organisms. And I think that the challenge is weighing those costs and benefits and understanding how we want the landscape to look and how we want, you know, what attributes do we want? Do we care about fish? If we do, then we should be managing to help protect fish. So understanding where your reference point is and where you might go into the future is really important when you think about cumulative effects, because kind of like death by a million cuts, if we have, you know, a million different land uses on the landscape, we may not notice those over you know, that's a number of years or even, you know, several years. But over decades, we start to really understand that our cumulative impact on the landscape can be quite substantial. As a society, we need to start really critically thinking about why we're living in the floodplain, what are the costs associated with living in the floodplain, who is responsible for those costs, is it on the taxpayer to continually pay for those that choose to live in the floodplain, and those aren't necessarily easy questions to answer. So I think that one of the big things is really evaluating why we're there, and if we want to be there, what are the risks associated with that, and who is then responsible for those risks? Because ultimately rivers are going to flood, they're going to continue to flood. Research shows that flooding intensity, so the level of flooding as well as the frequency of flooding is likely to increase into the future. So are we going to be dealing with this problem 8 years out of 10? Or, you know, is it going to be a reoccurring theme that we continually have to keep managing our infrastructure in the floodplain that is not critical? So things like people's homes, And it's a big risk that people are taking living there, and it's unfortunate. Like people can die. Like that's a pretty significant thing. So I think that we just need to really critically think about why we're there and then who's responsible for us being there.
The interception of moisture by soils and vegetation plays a significant part in how a watershed buffers precipitation. PhD student Shegaya Mirmansuri is investigating how changes in land use impacts a watershed's ability to absorb rainfall. The data she is compiling on cover crops, soils, and solar radiation is input to understand how the landscape responds to flooding.
Estimating water use in a watershed is very important in order to estimate water demand in a watershed. So with estimating water demand in a watershed, we can see how this water demand in the watershed can influence flood risk in the watershed. Different vegetation types, they have different water use. For example, we have different water use for forest area, agriculture area, and logging area. But there are two main reasons that they affect water use in a watershed. One is changing in land use or land use change, and another thing is climate change. For land use change, for example, when we have forest area and we turn the forest area from forest to mining area or logging area or another land use, so we will change the water use or vegetation water use or water demand in the watershed.
Having the scientific information is important, but how do we make sense of it for area residents and local governments? Reams of data, charts, and graphs do little to raise awareness in the general population and often serve to confuse people. Those living and working in the floodplain want to know when floods will happen and how it will affect them personally. Floods happen all the time, explains master's student Courtney Rieger, but they're only a problem when they impact people, their property, and their livelihood.
So my job is primarily to communicate the results of the floodplain mapping from the hydraulic model to the community. So members of the community are going to take this information and they're going to respond to the flooding events. Basically, if they can see themselves, they can visualize themselves in the event, before the event happens, then they'll be more prepared and hopefully more adapted to a disaster. So basically, with OpenStreetMap, people can just go online, they log in, everything, the base map is available to them. They have a satellite image, and with simple tracing technology, they can pinpoint their own house, they can pinpoint schools, they can pinpoint roads, they can map out bridges, and in the event of a flood, they can even map out where the flood has taken out the road or taken out a dike, and this information is extremely useful to people. So the hope with the flood solution strategy is to minimize damage and minimize losses. Property losses, loss of life, etc. The simple fact is that floods are going to happen. These people are living in a flood-prone region, and what we're trying to do is create resilient communities. Our resilient community is not only adaptive, but it's mitigative. So what they're doing is not only preparing for a flood, but they're also going to be better able to respond to the flood when it happens.
A lot of work has been done to better understand flooding in the Elk River watershed, but there's still a lot more to do. Variables are changing every day, and there will continue to be a need for research going forward. Researchers like Ryan McDonald and the Byrne team will continue to play a vital role in illustrating how our activities impact watersheds. Community groups like the Elk River Alliance also have an important role to play in educating the public on issues facing the environment. Watersheds are dynamic, living things, as complex as the organisms that call them home. They live and work together harmoniously as part of a greater, natural community. They bring forth life and sustain it, asking for nothing in return but our respect. As we move forward into the future, it is incumbent upon all of us to consider the stuff we are made of. Yes, it's mostly water. Thanks for watching.